Hello and welcome to tonight's panel on gender and humanitarian action. We are celebrating tonight in honor of International Women's Day, which was yesterday and was a public holiday in the ACT. My name is Nancy Schneider and I am the editor of Australian Outlook, the online publication of the Australian Institute of International Affairs. We have a live audience here in Canberra and we have guests participating via Zoom from all over the world. I would like to extend a very special welcome to all of the Icrc staff, volunteers, and affiliates who are joining us tonight, as well as the students in Dr. Kirsten Ainley's class at ANU. The AIIA hosts many events like this, multiple events a week. And so if you enjoy what you're doing tonight, you enjoy this event, then we invite you to come check out our other events that we're hosting at internationalaffairs.org.au/events. I would like to begin first by acknowledging that those of us in Canberra are currently sitting on the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal people, who are the traditional custodians of the ACT and the surrounding areas. I would also like to recognize the traditional custodians of the lands of each of our Zoom attendees. Together, we can pay our respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. Here with us this evening, we have Dr. Helen Durham, the Director of International Law and Policy for the Icrc. Hi, Helen. Can you say hello?
Good morning. I'm beaming in from chilly Geneva. It's -1 here, so it's nice to be back home and nice and warm for a moment.
We're so glad to have you here with us tonight, or morning for you. Helen oversees a large and diverse international network of people working towards the respective international humanitarian law. Helen is the former head of the Australia office of the Icrc, and she has worked in Geneva, Rome, and New York, and has field experience throughout the Pacific. In Canberra with us, we have Dr. Kamalini Lokipia and Lisa Cornish with DevEx. Kamalini leads the Humanitarian Research Program at the Research School of Public Health at the Australian National University. She has been heavily involved in Australia's COVID-19 response, and she has worked with a number of international humanitarian aid organizations, including the Icrc. She has spent extensive time providing medical care and epidemiological services for epidemics in Africa, the Middle East, the Pacific, and Southeast Asia. And Lisa is a senior reporter with DevEx, and she focuses on the Australian aid community and works as a data consultant with the Australian government. In the past year, Lisa has published several notable reports on how the provision and receipt of aid is changing as a result of the pandemic, and has recently turned to the crisis unfolding in Myanmar. Lisa previously worked with News Corp Australia as a data journalist, and her work has been published in regional and nationalist newspapers all around Australia. As I mentioned earlier, we're here in commemoration of International Women's Day, which provides an opportunity to celebrate the achievements of women, acknowledge the specific challenges that women face, and think critically about the ways in which these challenges can be addressed. But these challenges don't only apply to women. There are a number of people who come from different groups who are not traditionally discussed as female, that face these same challenges all across the gender spectrum. In the humanitarian space, the aid that is both provided and received is most effective when these gendered needs and experiences are carefully considered and integrated into action. Women and gender diverse people remain underrepresented as humanitarian actors, and there is great potential for delivering humanitarian assistance that better meets the needs of women, girls, and other vulnerable groups in conflict settings and disaster situations. With that, I turn it over to the panelists to briefly introduce themselves and discuss their work in the humanitarian sector, starting with Helen.
Oh, well, thank you. And once again, it's a great honor to be part of this important celebration, as well as acknowledgement that we've got a long way to go. So thank you for that. I think there is many advances the humanitarian sector, and I'll just talk for a moment for the Icrc and the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, which I've spent my professional life in putting on a gender lens, so to speak, in a lot of our more traditional work that I think has seen great bounds and leaps ahead. I wanted to specifically flag, because it's some work I'm doing doing recently is ensuring that we understand the work that Icrc does on the regulations of weapon systems through a gendered lens. And whether this be more traditional understandings that explosive weapons or unexploded ordnance have a disproportionate effect on women and girls, where we often traditionally think of these on a more battlefield that wouldn't involve as many women, whether we look at and start raising our voices on the creation of new weapon systems, autonomous lethal weapon systems, the use of artificial intelligence to make sure that gender biases aren't actually embedded in the weapon systems themselves. So I think there's a whole range of really important and interesting work being done around gender and weapons. And a couple of weeks ago, I had the pleasure of addressing NATO and a number of very senior military commanders to really raise these issues. And also I know my colleagues embed these ideas in some of the submissions we do to treaty bodies. The transfer of arms, small arms, has a disproportionate effect on women, particularly post-conflict, when you've got a lot more small arms available in society. So that was one area I wanted to say I think is often not talked about enough. It's a very masculine area, the use of weapons, calibers of the types of weapons that are used during conduct of hostilities, but we have to bring a gender lens into that. The second thing I wanted to briefly flag is the programming and needs assessment. I think we've really moved along, and I've got a long way to go as the humanitarian sector, but from sort of having that idea of do unto others as you'd like done to you, to do unto others as they would like done to them. And for example, I think there's a lot more work done in understanding the needs of men who have been sexually abused in detention. The Icrc visits at least over 1 million individuals during the year who are detained, and it's really, really important that we take into account that men are also victims of sexual violence when they're detained in times of conflict and situations of violence. So there were two areas I just wanted to flag. And perhaps to finish on my first section, I also wanted to flag a more personal story and the need for us to also use our humour. We need to use our intellect, our rigour, we need to use data, but we also need to use sometimes a relaxed nature when we engage with issues of gender. Many years ago, I was going to a Southeast Asian country to give a large presentation on issues related to, sorry, we'll just get that change, large issues related to conducts of hostilities. And I walked into the room, it was filled with military, and for some reason the military, senior military commander there thought that I was the assistant, and he asked me to get him a cup of tea and to photocopy a document. And I decided that actually, why not? So I found the kitchen, I made him a cup of tea, I took it across to him, I gave him a smile, and then I got up on stage as the keynote and spent 4 hours lecturing on conduct of hostilities. And it was really interesting to see his response. So it's just a personal sense when gender issues don't but quite fit, and they are not looking for a Dr. Durham to be a woman, you sometimes can use different strategies. I'm sure that commander going forward will perhaps think twice in putting us in categories. So just a couple of small examples, plus some of the programming issues. Thanks very much, and I'll give it back to you, Nancy.
Thank you so much, Helen. I can't believe that I can't even imagine what that person was feeling whenever he saw you standing up there for so long speaking after having received a cup of tea from you. Kamalini, would you like to go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself and your experience with gender and the humanitarian space?
Thanks, Nancy, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today, and thank you to everyone who's attending in person and virtually. So Nancy asked me to, in this initial brief, to talk about a couple of 1 or 2 situations where I thought a gendered response was either positive or negative. I've done humanitarian work for 25 years, and I would say that every single thing you do is gendered. But I do think that in the humanitarian space, kind of it telescopes things. So the role of women becomes, I think, far more emphasized, far more apparent. So, you know, I've worked in a lot of IDP refugee settings. The men often lose their traditional roles as breadwinner, as protector, whereas the women's roles continue of looking after the family, feeding the family. So I would say that everything is gendered, but given that, I've thought about a couple of examples, both of which are both positive and negative, and then I'll end with what they taught me. So one comes from very early in my career. It was one of the first patients I had who'd been raped. She'd been raped by a paramilitary soldier, and she came to me. She was a very young woman because when she'd been raped, she'd had her child on her back. So she wanted me to make sure her child was safe. So she started telling me her story, and I started to cry. I still remember her patting my knee and saying, "You'll be okay." And I thought, oh. But anyway, that particular experience, so I gave her medical treatment, and we built a relationship. She came back to me quite a few times, and she brought several female relatives of hers, friends who had also had similar experiences. And often they'd come together and we'd talk about just being a woman in those settings. And one thing they said to me was, everyone is interested in this experience of rape. So everybody wants us to talk about it. And, you know, but then we want to talk about also that our children don't have food and we want food for them. And no one seems interested in that. And they said, why is that, Kamalini? And I still haven't got a clear answer, but I thought, is that us as humanitarian actors bring our values, our fears, that we can understand being worried about being raped in the dark on our way to home from work, but we can't understand in our setting what it's like to watch your child starve to death. So that was very early on in my career, and I thought, everything I do from now, I'm going to try and find out, what do people actually, what do they need, what do they worry about, what do they want me to do? So the next example is from much more recently in my career. I went to evaluate a health clinic for survivors of family and sexual violence. And, you know, it was just a long procession of, you know, women with forearm fractures, skull fractures, children who've been raped. And, you know, they were getting good quality medical care. But on the last day I was there, two of the national staff, so two of the nurses who work in that clinic, said, we need to talk to you, Kamalini. They took me to one of the treatment rooms. They locked the door, and for 2 hours they told me what it was like to work for an organisation who told them that their job was medical care and nothing beyond. So these were people on local salaries, not high. In their lunch breaks, they would take women to court to help them get protection orders. After work, they would give them from their own salary money to get a bus ticket to leave the city they were at risk in. So that I told them, I will try and help you do this work, but do it in a structured way. That was some years ago. With help from others here in Australia, things, we set up an NGO, which is now gets many $1 million funding. It's one of the largest NGOs providing case management services in that setting. It's run by these local national staff, largely women. They are at every level, and it provides the service both they and their patients, their clients wanted. So what I learned from that is, as a humanitarian actors, often we think we know what is needed. We often think there is not time to figure out what is needed. You never succeed. I've done Ebola outbreaks, I've done gender-based violence. You never achieve what you want unless you understand what the communities you're working for need, prioritize, and the context they live in.
Thank you, Kamalini. I think that really, really speaks back to what Helen said about do unto others as they would like to have done. I believe I got that right. And I think that really, like, having not necessarily coordinated those responses, really they do link together very, very emphatically. Lisa, would you like to go ahead and tell us about your experiences and how
Yeah.
gender has come in there?
Yeah, well, as mentioned in the introduction, I am actually a reporter. So I do get to tell some stories about fantastic women in the sector. Being from the outside, women in the sector, women in particular, are quite comfortable in telling me stories that they are not necessarily comfortable telling internally. And being very topical in what we're experiencing in Australia, something that does come up is the dealing of sexual harassment and harassment in organisations. and how that's dealt with. Now, DevEx have had a number of stories in the past year about how cases of sexual harassment in particular has been dealt with. And not only have these women faced something that no one wants to deal with, but the system that responded to them, they felt also failed them. So there are a number of stories we've had of that, but I also get people that come to me and tell me stories who aren't necessarily comfortable going on the record. And these are people who will tell me that they don't want to be blacklisted. They fear that they're going to lose their job, they're going to lose their financial security, and they understand that the perpetrators will potentially do this to other people. And they don't feel comfortable because they tell me that the systems fail them. They see what happens elsewhere and they don't have comfort that these issues will be dealt with. So some of the stories I've heard are horrible. We're talking just from verbal abuse to gaslighting, to stalking, to unwanted advances, to actual sexual assault. And these are issues that are dealt with privately by these women, and these women are just not dealing well with it. So I've heard these stories, they're horrible. There's nothing I can do because that's their story to tell, that's not mine. So for every story we are able to tell, there is dozens and dozens more that we're not able to tell. Now, you've got to think, how do these women not have the comfort in the systems? They don't believe that that it's dealt with appropriately in the organisation, that the processes aren't right, that any surveys, they don't feel that they're anonymous and they can talk privately and they can talk confidently about their experiences. I think within the Australian sector as well, an investigation that ACFID led into sexual assault in the sector, they didn't feel that there were enough responses, and that raises a lot of questions about how confident are people in talking about what's happening in this sector. And it also then raises the question of, you know, if people are feeling this way, they're talking to others about this, if they don't feel protected and enabled by their organisation, how are you going to get more people who are seen as vulnerable within that organisation to support the communities that you want to support as well? This is really important. Even recently, the UN Women, Perna Sen, who was the executive coordinator and spokesperson on addressing sexual harassment and other forms of discrimination, she left that role because she didn't feel supported. She was being told a lot of things within the organisation because she kind of had a little bit of independence through the UN system, of a lot of people just saying, don't have any confidence. I don't trust the systems. I don't trust the processes. I don't trust that when I make a statement, I am protected and I will be anonymous. This is really problematic. That role that she had now no longer exists. It's been merged into other functions, but that role no longer exists. And from sources, we were told that within UN Women, they were told that the crisis was over. Whether that meant Me Too or something else, we're not sure, but that is a real cause of concern. So this is really continuing in terms of, you know, how the sector deals with it. It's got to be dealt with properly. You've got to really listen to women, gender diverse groups, people who are seen as vulnerable within your organisation. Make sure that they can anonymously speak about their experiences. Donors also really need to put a burden on organisations. If you are funding an organisation and they're reporting about this, are you confident in what's being reported? We know that there's a lot of surveys because people do not want to put their name to a piece of paper because they know that they'll easily be identifiable. How many people are responding? Can you really tell that this organisation is dealing with this properly, that they're protecting women, that they're protecting the vulnerable? So this is a real major cause of concern that in my job, I will either listen to people who want to tell me this, and where we can, we will tell their stories because it's not going away. whether the UN women agree with that or not. It's not going away. It never will. This sector is working in an environment where people are under pressure. Bullying will happen. We know that. Sexual assault, unfortunately, will also happen, and it needs to be dealt with better.
Thank you, Lisa. That is a really interesting story, especially to come out of UN Women, where you would expect these problems to be in their least harmful form.
Yes.
So moving on to the question and answer portion of this evening. I am going to open up the floor now to both our live audience and to our online audience to ask questions of our panelists that they would like to understand on topics that they would like to understand more about how gender and international affairs, or how gender and humanitarian action intersect, and how those two issues play out with one another. So without further ado, if anyone in the live audience has any questions, please feel free to raise your hand. And if anyone on Zoom has any questions, type them into the chat box and we will get to them. Anyone in person?
Hi, I'm Siobhan from the Embassy of Afghanistan. I just wanted to know if you could touch on any issues of the humanitarian crisis for women in Afghanistan at the moment, especially with the peace talks and escalating tensions and violence in the country. Thanks.
I think that's a great question. Carmelina, I believe you have experience in Afghanistan. Is that?
But not recent experience.
Yeah.
So I was last there in 1996. So it's a long time ago. It was the start of the Taliban there. But yeah, no, I don't have recent direct experience. I've not been working there.
Helen or Lisa? Helen, go ahead.
Hi, thanks. Well, thank you very much for the question. I think it's important not to just state the meta level of the ideas and actually to look at situations. I won't look at specific situation because I haven't had a briefing from my colleagues in Afghanistan, but I can certainly put you in touch with my colleagues who are in Sydney at the ICRC, in Canberra, where we are today in the ICRC, who can give you some more details. But what I did want to flag to you is I think increasingly, certainly the programming that the ICRC does in Afghanistan is looking not at gender as a specific issue, but the intersectionality. And it was something I think we really need to look at, which is not only the role and the treatment of women in Afghanistan. And we all know that not only is there some real struggles, and I'm sure you would probably, I often find people who ask questions at events often have more answers than us panelists. So I'd love to hear if you have more information. But I think that certainly from talking more recently, my colleague who runs the work on intersectionality, where we're really trying to get diversity into the humanitarian system of the ICRC. She recently, a couple of weeks ago, went to Afghanistan and went constantly around the area to talk to our local colleagues, to talk to Afghani women, men, and others who are working for the ICRC. Because I think many of the other two speakers this morning have raised this issue about the humanitarian sector is a lot about power structure. And often you find the distinction between what we call mobile staff and resident staff can be quite disempowering. And there's a real need to listen more carefully and to take into account not only are women in Afghanistan still facing huge struggles, but they also have some incredible answers if we stop and listen and understand what their real needs are, but also the intersectionality issue. What does being a disabled woman in Afghanistan mean? What does it mean to have some mental health problems or to have some other issues that you need to take into account? So thanks for the question. And as I said, you can certainly follow up with my colleagues in the ICRC Canberra for specific details. But I do think what you raise is this real need to take a wider look and to program in a much more comprehensive way, not, I think, as we've spoken about before, looking specifically at the siloed approach of how we engage with the amazing women in Afghanistan. Thanks, Nancy.
Thank you, Helen. I think we have another question from the audience.
Thank you for the presentations. My name is Ernst Wilhelm. I'm a member of the Canberra branch of the Institute of International Affairs. I'd like to ask about women in Syria. As I understand it, there are quite a number of women in camps in Syria whose husbands were ISIS or other fighters and who've been killed. And the women are now in refugee camps, sometimes with children. And some countries, I think 1 or 2 countries are willing to take them back. A number of other countries are not willing to take them back. I gather there are quite a number of women with Australian citizenship whose husbands were fighting for ISIS. I think there's concern that some of them may harbour ISIS-related political views. Others were simply victims of their husbands. I'd be interested in your comments on the policies that countries like Australia should follow in relation to Australian citizens in this situation.
Thank you. I think that's a really interesting question and certainly a very important one. Lisa, is that one that you would be able to speak to?
This is one where I think we all have our opinions, in which case, like myself, an Australian citizen is an Australian citizen, regardless of, you know, opinions or associations in that space, especially when we're dealing with children as well. I mean, this is kind of like Australia in this space, unfortunately, the lack of humanitarian and just humanity in a lot of some of our policies, the fact that we've got a family in Christmas Island that have been there for years now. This is unsurprising from the Australian government. It certainly is something that is bringing up a lot of political conflict, as we know, between Australia and New Zealand in this space. But in terms of, interested in Helen's opinion as well of how this is actually perceived on an international scale, whether Australia is getting away with this type of thing, because this is the type of pressure that needs to really come from overseas in Australia and really put the hard word that this behaviour won't be tolerated.
Thanks, and thank you very much for the question once again. I think it's something that the ICRC is deeply concerned about globally. We visit the many thousands of children and women in northeast Syria, for example, in the Al-Hol camps and others, and it is really, really important that these women and children, as you noted, that had some sort of association with specific groups are treated with humanity. And the first thing I would say is we are putting strongly on the table of all states globally the need to not forget them in relation to things such as COVID vaccines and others. It's very easy for such groups to slip off the table when then, you know, off the table as in the mind frame, the legal and diplomatic landscape. So the first thing I would say is thank you for raising the question, because there are many, many thousands of women and children that need support and need to be treated humanely. I won't go into the specifics in relation to Australia's specific role, but I would just say with many, many states, the ICRC is raising the exact issue that you flagged, which is the obligations, international legal obligations of how you treat your citizens, that there is no capacity for an individual to be without nationality. And there are very clear and binding and customary legal requirements that states have signed up to and have agreed to ensure that they treat their citizens in a certain way. Now, that is not conditional upon what the citizen has done or hasn't done. So I think this is a big debate we need to continue to have. I think that raising it, reminding states of their legal obligations, and just reminding everyone that these are humans. And even along the spectrum, no matter what has been done or not, it is incredibly important that they don't stay in places where they're up for incredible physical, psychological trauma. And the other thing I would say from a sociological point of view, the best way to continue to create individuals who want to do harm to a state globally is to treat them in an inhumane way. There is the capacity to treat and return individuals to their countries. So as I said, I think this is an important discussion, but in this current climate where we're looking at vulnerabilities, we must not forget the groups of people, particularly those who are in detention for for the basic human rights and the basic obligations under international humanitarian law. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. And Kamalini, extending on that question, could you speak a bit about how you as a care provider put aside people's actions prior to receiving care from you, and how that impacted or didn't impact the care that was provided?
I think, you know, we face it. I've worked in emergency departments in Australia, and I would get families where, you know, severe domestic violence, and you have to treat both the perpetrator and the survivor, the victim, often their children. It's the same anywhere, right?
Yeah.
You think your role is to provide medical care, but I do think that part of that role in these types of contexts is advocacy and witnessing. So I think it's inappropriate to do that in the context of an individual's. So someone comes to me for medical care, I don't think it's appropriate to then pass the information on to the protection or the advocacy person for doing a campaign. That's the decision of that individual. But if I see recurrently a pattern where a trauma assault is happening because of a particular thing, that people don't have safe latrines, then part of that is to advocate for better latrines in that setting. But, you know, I see I started this work 25 years ago, and after my first mission, I came and did a degree in international humanitarian law, because having never done any law, I thought it was just like here, and there'll be these global cops who'd come and arrest bad people. And I realized very quickly that wasn't the case. And I see an ongoing deterioration of, you know, if you can carve out part of your country from a convention on the refugee convention, I do think that a lot of it's lip service. So we must keep saying it, you know, like I've done prison visits to horrendous conditions, and we have to keep saying, but also I think the power comes from talking to people. So the people of Australia, if they expect better from their government, things will change. So I speak to them about my experiences.
Right.
But to going back to your question, I think you have no choice if someone comes to you for medical care. And often if your neutrality and your impartiality is why you are safe.
Yes.
You know, I don't work in armed settings. I don't work with armed security.
Mm-hmm.
What keeps me safe is that everybody knows I will provide them care without distinction.
Right.
And so it's a core part of why you can do your job. You think of that and you try to forget the rest.
Right, of course. Thank you. I have a question from our online audience on the politics of humanitarianism and the impact of power structures. How do you take into account the complicity and harm of liberal states, which often fund or support humanitarian action and organizations, while also participating in the arms trade or benefiting from unequal global economic structures, and sometimes the complicity of humanitarian actors themselves? For example, we have started to see important research on abuses by humanitarian actors when thinking about what humanitarians can and should do. Lisa, you talked about donors and where the donors are looking into organizations. What about organizations looking out at the donors?
Yeah, well, it is absolutely vice versa. The same, if you're asking questions, you need to be as thorough as possible. And these are all fantastic questions, because who are you working with? Increasingly, you need to be looking at private sector partners. What's in their circle? What's in their sphere? How much checking are you actually doing? These are really important, because, you know, one little thing is enough to ruin all that work that you're doing. So you really need to be thinking more than someone's coming and saying, here's a big bucket of cash. Right. Who are they? Who's behind it? Who do they work with? What have they done? What are their objectives? What are their overarching goals, including governments as well? Are you also funding, Australia is a good example, going into the weapons space? Is this the right thing by working with them? Are you encouraging that type of behaviour? And you've got to think about the objectives. What are you trying to do? Who are you trying to support? By accepting that, by encouraging the behavior of that partner, does that undo everything that you did? So yeah, it's easy to kind of look at the high level, but you've got to go so much deeper. And there's a lot of things that you need to ask about, well, what's not there? And I think this is really important. What aren't I seeing? What haven't you told me? And asking for more. And if they can't provide that, that's a red flag.
Right. Go ahead, Helen.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think it's, once again, thanks for a fabulous question. I do think we want to also come back to women at some point because it is International Women's Day. Having said that, I do think these are important conversations we need to have. So if you break down that question a little bit, I think the donor issue is really interesting. I mean, Icrc, we take money from states who want to contribute, and of course, states are involved in a range of things. I mean, I think certainly I can only speak from an Icrc perspective. If these states do not try and influence our impartiality and our neutrality in putting conditions on donations, that is a no-go. You know, it's really great, I must admit, that in my role as Director of International Law and Policy, that I don't talk about money when I go and talk to capitals at very senior, powerful states. I go there to talk about the issues. And I think what we need to really have a clarity is, as long as they're not putting pressure on us to change our work, that is the one of the important lines to draw. And the other issue is for us to then be able to influence back. So I think the donor issue, I understand my colleagues in, for example, Médecins Sans Frontières have a different view, and that's fantastic. But as an organisation that is over almost $2 billion with our assistance work and others, the engagement with governments is something that is often asked ethically. How can you take money from one government and actually then be working in something else? But I do think that the fine line is never to be crossed, to be influenced by those you get donations from. And this is where independence and neutrality is critical. On the other hand, I think you raised really well and importantly, increasingly the need to engage with the private sector, companies and others. And for example, we've spent a lot of my time in the last couple of years working on ethical screenings for companies that wish to contribute to Icrc. We have to have an ethical screening. So you can't, for example, we can't take money from organizations that are engaged in the manufacture of illegal weapons. It doesn't make sense. In the private sector, that doesn't make sense. And exactly as you said, a nice big juicy bucket of money might be able to do amazing things in setting up a hospital in Afghanistan or South Sudan. But if actually we are contributing to an industry, that being said, now's not to go into it, but it's very, very complicated. Companies have sub-companies who have sub-companies. What is the percentage? Just about every many big companies have a small percentage of their money that goes into some sort of research that eventually, so we've got a whole system of checking backwards. So I think that's really important. Then I want to come back for 1 second on the women issue and raising very beautifully the question about the requirement internally about how we treat sort of each other as humanitarians. I think humanitarians are people. You get any large group of people. The Icrc, for example, has 20,000 colleagues globally. You take a 20,000 people globally and you're going to find people who are beautiful people, and you're going to find people who abuse or potentially aren't responsible with systems of power. And therefore we need to have, and we are, strong code of conducts, strong capacity to investigate and actually dismiss. I mean, in the last few years, there's been numerous people dismissed from Icrc on breaching the code of conducts. And it's quite a wide thing. It's about not treating each other in a respectful way. So I think we need the donors to keep the pressure on us, to keep us having segregated data in relation to how we treat our own people and then how we treat the beneficiaries. I think that is a critical issue. But listening to women, whether they're women that we engage with and serve, whether they're women who are colleagues, is critical. I can't stress more strongly. I think it's been a thin thread that's been through all our presentations, listening carefully to what people's experiences are and what their needs are, and particularly finding the space to allow women to speak. I think that is something which we cannot overlook, and we must keep reminding everyone in the humanitarian sector for our own staff and for those that we serve. Thanks, Nancy.
Thank you so much, Helen. I think that is a really excellent point that leads into another question from our online audience. We have a recent graduate who is hoping to go into the humanitarian sector and who is a survivor of sexual abuse, who is wondering how you separate your emotional investment in gender issues from more data-driven, objective approaches that are required for gender to be taken seriously within larger power structures. As you mentioned, the codes of conduct and working to make sure that you're both neutral and you're listening, but that you're following larger structures. This person also wonders when survivors can really realistically allow themselves to step back from these triggering conversations when it's such an important topic that always needs as much support as it can within the development and humanitarian space.
I will say on this that there is a group that has been formed called NANSHI, which is survivors of assault within organisations, and they do support other people in listening and having conversations and things like that. In terms of stepping away from that experience, that is not something that I think anyone could provide that personal advice on. You need to be kind of open and have that conversation and be willing to acknowledge it. But also the work of gender, as has been discussed, covers all forms of work in this space. So it doesn't always necessarily mean violence. We're talking about, in the space that, there's women as workers, there's women as mothers, there's women in schools, there's women here. So supporting women and gender diverse groups within the humanitarian space, there's so much work to do. So maybe it is also making sure that you're aware of your barriers, putting your hand up and acknowledging it. But I think our other speakers can also provide advice there, but there is lots and lots and lots of work that needs to be done. And it was mentioned as well about data. There's so many gaps in everything there. So even building that knowledge that we need about the women, the girls, the different diverse groups that need support, that still needs to be built up. We've got so much gaps in knowledge that it's very hard to program effectively when we don't really know how many women are out there, how many older women, how many women with disabilities, how many women in the workforce, how many women in schools. There's a lot of countries where those gaps just exist.
Right. Thank you so much, Lisa. Kamalini, is that a question that you can speak to?
So I guess, my experience working on, for example, gender-based violence, and this person asked, in a setting of very high prevalence, many of the staff we recruited were in active situations of domestic violence. It's dangerous for that person and for their patients, for their clients, to ask them to provide that service while they're actively being exposed to the violence themselves. So part of your role as an organisation is not to say you can't work for us if you've been a survivor. One, you won't get staff in many settings, but your first obligation is to provide care. And some of the best, workers we've seen, Grace Payne, right? Some of the best advocates, workers are true survivors, but part of the organisation responsibility is to make sure that they have moved through that and they have survived and they are strong. So that's been my experience of this. So I'd advise this person, if they are thinking of doing this work, there are roles that won't expose them to the direct need to provide care to those who've had experiences such as herself or himself. Also to find an organisation that will support them, and also to think, have they moved through, are they a survivor now and at the point where they can provide care, or do they need to go through that process themselves first?
Right. And I'm sure the level of empathy that one has as a survivor is completely different to the level of empathy that one has as someone who cares but who can't empathize but can only sympathize.
I think, again, I think, you know, when you are so traumatized that you only are able to provide empathy and not provide action,
Right.
you know,
right.
so it's both.
Yeah.
Right? Empathy, I think, is really important, but women, men, children who've experienced, they want you to change their lives, help them change their lives.
Yeah.
Empathy alone is not going to do that.
Correct. Okay.
So you need to have the resources, and you need to be in an organization that provides you the structure to really help them change their situation. Again, you know, survivors come and they're given therapeutic counseling. All the data from developed countries and things, if you're being bashed every night at home, there is no point getting counseling to feel better about it. That's going to make it worse. What you need is support to get out of it, to get your children out of it, whatever. So I do think it's a highly specialized area. Many of the best people I've worked with have been survivors, but it's an organizational responsibility, not to say you've been through it, so you'll be good at doing it. It's a different question.
Thank you.
If I could just quickly add in, I think what this raises is the importance of taking into account secondary degree trauma, and increasingly the humanitarian sector is looking after or waking up to the need to look after the mental health of workers. I spent years taking evidence from women who are victims of sexual violence. And I think there is this sense too of, as you articulated, we need to have empathy, but we need to know the systems, we need to know the structure. And I think we need to distinguish between frontline work with those people, such as dealing directly, policy work, and a range of things. So what I would say is, thank you to this individual for the bravery and the interest of what has happened to them, but think carefully and engage carefully about where your role, specific role, would fit in. And I do think, particularly for women, the mental health and keeping, you know, during the pandemic, everyone's talking about mental health. This is great. It was long overdue, but being with a secondary engagement can also have challenges. And I think it's incredibly important we don't categorize people. We don't say, you know, just because someone's had this experience, this is their skill set. I think we need to really understand this is a sophisticated and nuanced way of dealing, and we've got to look after those who are the humanitarians, as well as those that we work with to try and provide some sort of support. So I just wanted to flag the mental health issue. And I do think women often don't speak about it because they've got mental health issues that they feel that they need to keep going on for their communities and their families. So, you know, on International Women's Day, I would say, let's look after the mental health of women.
I agree. Thank you so much, Helen. I believe we have a question from our audience in Canberra.
Hi guys, my name is Grace. I'm currently an intern at the Institute of International Affairs. I think you've all highlighted to me how much gender is important in this space. And you've also spoken a lot about how giving it really important. This is also for Helen more specifically. How do you think the law can change to deal with these sort of issues?
Great. So I think it went fuzzy for a minute. The law in relation to general humanitarian issues or conflict. Would you mind narrowing it down a little bit?
Sort of general humanitarian issues and how we can focus on a top-down solution as well as.
Okay, well, look, thank you. It's a great question. It's a broad question, and I know we haven't got a lot of time, so perhaps I'll slice it into areas. I mean, I think number one is to make sure that the international law, and I'll focus for a second, international humanitarian law, has a gendered reading. Isn't just, you know, people often say the laws of war traditionally were created by men, for men, about men, you know, regulating non-conflict. Whereas in fact, there is a range of really strong protections for women, but also increasingly understanding that the law, whether it be IHL or human rights law, has to take into account that women just aren't only vulnerable, they aren't only victims during times of armed conflict, and to allow, whether it be a legal setting of peace negotiations or others, to take into the agency that women also have. If we only put them in the category of victims, we are overlooking a huge way we can improve the world. Certainly in the last few years, and some of my professional career have spent looking at clarifying that sexual violence is a war crime, is a crime against humanity, is genocide. And I think we've come a long way with really excellent jurisprudence, so excellent judgments coming out of international tribunals on that matter. So I think we have the clarity in those areas. But now we need to look at issues relating to the need to take into account women's protection in, for example, in detention, and in the specific needs that women have that we need to interpret or advance in relation to how we treat those who are in detention. And sometimes it's complicated. If I could just use one example, the vast majority of people who are detained during armed conflict tend to be men. But the laws of war do allow for specific treatment of women. But often that means that women then are separated from the men for legitimate and good reasons for protection. But then they're put in a much lower conditions of detention, because in the implementation of the law, you might have a large number of men, a small number of women, and they could get put out the back in a much more difficult situation. So I think you're right, the legal framework needs to be worked on, and that's a whole seminar in and of itself. But what I think we're really interested in on the ground, how is the implementation of that, making sure that we take into account the specific needs and strengths of women. The final thing I would say is we have to stop classifying women in the same category as children and others. I think there's an important discourse to say, have a diversity of voices. But certainly my experience when I was in Myanmar, when I was in Aceh, when I've been in Iraq, in detention, in places of IDP camps, you really do find women not only vulnerable, and I think this is a critical voice that we need to add in. We can't underestimate the challenges that women have, but their resilience, their tenacity, and the ideas and answers they have to problems is really critical too. So there's a whole lot of legal work to be done, but I think more importantly, the translation of the legal principles onto the ground and into the reality is critical as well. But thanks for that question. We could do a seminar on that another day.
That would be fantastic, Helen. I would love to organize that. Lisa or Kamalini, do you have anything to add on the international law, how international law can be used to change the way that women are perceived, or that women are affected, or that women are helped by humanitarian actors? No.
I think Helen was the right person.
Yeah,
to answer that.
Helen was absolutely the right person to ask for that. I wanted to get back to, Lisa, something that you said about looking into all of the different groups of people who are within organizations who are having experiences that are based on their personal characteristics, their gender, their disability, their age, their legal status, kind of all of these personal characteristics. Thinking about kind of the intersectionality of all of these personal characteristics, at what point do you start to get too compartmentalized and lose out on the fact that these are all groups of people who need support?
Yeah, I mean, it is the challenge, but we do know that the needs are different for everyone. And so I was more talking about in terms of the response, knowing where people are and who they are.
Yeah.
So especially if we're dealing with an emergency response, a cyclone, you want to know where elderly people are, where people with disability are, what equipment they need. You need to go into quite a lot of detail. At the same time, there's that balancing when it comes to data about how much can you collect, and how do you collect it while not breaching privacy. Now, it'd be very easy in a small community in a remote area that there is one woman aged 65 who is blind and has a wheelchair. You're going to be able to see that person, and then you've got to be really careful with that data and what you do with it, and how you plan and prepare for that. But at the moment, there's just too many gaps that there is so many people that are just missing as part of the response. We know in the Pacific that people with disability, especially women with disability, are constantly overlooked, that they might be evacuated, and what they need to support themselves, their equipment, their wheelchair, their devices, don't come with them because that information doesn't exist.
Right.
So it is a challenge at the moment, but investment needs to be made in that data. I think from last count, 0.3% of all development assistance goes into data and data collection.
Right.
That's not enough, considering, especially in the Pacific where we are, the amount of natural disasters and emergencies that we're going to face. You're never going to catch up with the data that you need. So there's a lot of call, especially when it comes to gender data, to invest more, even just 1% of ODA. It's not a priority of donors at the moment, unfortunately. But this is definitely a space that we need to ensure that we are helping the vulnerable. We know where they are. And it's not just humanitarian players. Those communities, when they have the information that they can go back to governments, they can say, this is why you need to support us. They've got the evidence base that helps them make the case as well.
Thank you. That's a really interesting answer that I think makes a lot of sense, that you need to know where people are, and that kind of specific data actually does make a lot of sense to be able to help people.
Yeah.
I think we have time for one final question from the audience. And anyone in Canberra or online, please feel free to type through your questions. Go ahead.
If there's nothing else, can I take Helen back to the question of Syria? You spoke about the responsibilities of a state in relation to its citizens. But what about rogue states which don't accept those responsibilities? Now, sorry, I'll start again. You spoke about the responsibility of states to its citizens in the context of my earlier question on Syria. But what about rogue states which don't accept those responsibilities? We know that Australia won't accept a range of international responsibilities. For example, in relation to refugees, ever since the Tampa, Australia doesn't accept its international responsibilities. We know it didn't accept its international responsibilities in relation to Timor-Leste. And I think the prospects of the current minister accepting responsibilities in relation to women in Syria of Australian citizens are fairly remote. What can the International Committee of the Red Cross do for those women other than lecturing a government which won't listen? What sort of assistance can in fact be provided?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the question. And of course, I won't go into too much detail. And just to rest assured, we never lecture. I mean, our posture is always to come in and provide very clearly what the existing legal obligations are, to understand whether it be Australia or any other country, what is the challenges they have in implementing their existing obligation? Is it because of public opinion? Is it because they don't have an infrastructure, because they're worried if they bring individuals back in any country that they won't be able to prosecute them if they believe they've undertaken activities, excuse me, that are of an illegal nature? So I think the first thing is, it's really important that, because governments, like anyone, doesn't really respond well to a lecture, but sometimes we have to be very stern and also really have the best quality information at our fingertips. So I think what your question is really getting at, which I think is good, is the inherent frustration we feel, I think, as humans, with seeing that there are international laws that prohibit things, and seeing that actually states, even when they sign up to them, don't always follow them. And I think that's an inherent frustration that I certainly feel as an international lawyer for 25, almost 30 years of my life. I've had to find a way to absorb, and we have to be patient. We have to be persistent, but we have to be extremely passionate. And those three things fight against each other. But taking that aside, I think it's a really important question, whether it be about obligations relating to women or traditional international legal obligations. States are sovereign. And so I think there are a range of mechanisms out there. Issues can be put on the debate of in places such as the Security Council. There can be pressure put on by other states to states. We can continue to raise the humanitarian issues, put them on the table. There can be, obviously tools such as civil society raising their voices. You saw over the years when society does raise their voice, particularly in a country like Australia, things do move and happen. It's just that often the really critical issues people in the community aren't interested in or actually have a specific concern about. So without giving you a satisfactory answer, unfortunately, the ICRC isn't as powerful as I think people would sometimes expect us to be. But I think it's about continuing to have strong, evidence-based, compelling engagement, to continue to then talk to other states, to engage in making sure that there is a knowledge out there, and to make sure that these issues don't slip off the public agenda. So there's only so much that can be done, but I have seen many issues from behind the scenes, us engaging with governments over time change, but I think we need to continue to keep discussing this, and I think my heart goes to many of the women who have come from many different nationalities globally who are in a terrible situation in northeast Syria, and I think every state needs to live up to their responsibilities in that regard, and we will continue to talk to governments globally in our traditional bilateral and confidential nature, but we need you as a community to keep understanding what's going on. So thanks for that really good question. And I'm sorry, I always feel like I give a very unsatisfactory answer to what is a complex area. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. I think the entire structure of international law sounds like it is that kind of a lot of power and a lot of frustration. I would like to end this evening with one final question to Kamalini. Your role in contact tracing, both through epidemics throughout Africa and the rest of the world, have contributed a lot to what Australia is currently doing with contact tracing for the COVID-19 pandemic. We are talking a lot, we as in the broader discourse, are talking a lot about how this pandemic is affecting both women and men and people of all genders differently. What are some areas of gender and the current pandemic that we're not talking about that we should be?
Not talking enough about.
Yeah.
I think I keep hearing about vulnerability and how, whether it's migrants or that this group needs to be helped because of themselves, but it's just like every outbreak. We saw in Victoria, the reason people were at risk was because they were working in low-paid, insecure work. They were living in public housing. They were living in large households where multiple people worked in high-risk settings. So, the mother may have been a cleaner in aged care, the father would be working in an abattoir plus being an Uber driver, and the daughter would be working in another 3 aged care facilities. So it's these people, and like Helen said, it's often the women who keep this community, the society functioning. We've seen that, young people, women are at high risk. And we see that as a vulnerability, but that's because they are keeping our society functioning. And I think our community understands that. If you ask, and I've done this, anybody, should we pay aged care workers a decent wage so that they can work in one place and provide good care and get trained? Everyone says yes, but we're at the same time reviewing our industrial relations to make our rate of casualised insecure work, which is one of the highest in the OECD, even higher. So I do think, but what we do know is that governments listen to communities, and our community has come through this time well because we have worked together, because we believe that the collective is the right thing for the individual. And, it's been my experience in every humanitarian setting. What surprised me, which it shouldn't have, is how similar it is in Australia. But I think that, again, by and large, the community understands these things because they live it. And so, like, as we've just told, it's our job to keep our government accountable, to ask them to do what we know is the right and the smart thing to do. So I've forgotten your question, actually. I got on my soapbox. I hope it answers.
I'll just add one thing as well, besides just the vulnerability, there's also been those vulnerable groups stepping up in filling the gap of information and communication, which is really vital at this at this stage with COVID, not just in Australia, but internationally. So there is a lot of vulnerable communities that really identify a gap that they need to have people informed to make sure that they understand that there's no misinformation. And those groups are really stepping up to ensure that they're not left behind.
That's fantastic. That's great to hear. Thank you so much to everyone who is here in Canberra in person, to everyone who is on Zoom with us, and especially to our panelists, Dr. Kamalini Lakuga, Lisa Cornish, and to Dr. Helen Durham from Geneva. And so good night to everyone and good morning to Helen. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Nancy.
Thank you.